Breaking news from the heart of Gaza City. Massive Israeli airstrikes pound Hamas strongholds as the IDF launches one of its largest operations in years. Explosions light up the skyline, casualties mount, and the entire region braces for what could be a turning point in this escalating conflict. Stay with us as we break down the unfolding chaos. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're covering a story that is dominating headlines around the world. Heavy airstrikes have struck Gaza City as the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, launch a major military operation against Hamas. The skies above Gaza lit up overnight with the thunder of missiles and bombs, while residents rush for safety in shelters. Israel claims the strikes are aimed at Hamas command centers, weapons depots, and tunnels, but the destruction on the ground has been immense, spreading fear among civilians caught in the crossfire. Gaza's hospitals are already overwhelmed, with ambulances rushing in casualties from every neighborhood. The IDF has described the campaign as a decisive move to weaken Hamas' ability to launch rockets into Israeli territory, but international observers are warning that this could spiral into a broader conflict with devastating humanitarian consequences. For many people living in Gaza, the sound of explosions and collapsing buildings is nothing new, but the scale of this operation is much larger than recent skirmishes. Political analysts suggest this might be Israel's strongest push in years to dismantle Hamas infrastructure. Yet, the big question remains, will this operation achieve its intended goals, or will it trigger even greater resistance and retaliation? In this video, we'll take you step by step through what's happening on the ground, the strategies at play, the regional reactions, and the potential global fallout of this latest escalation in the Gaza conflict. The first reports of the strikes came late at night when residents of Gaza City described hearing loud booms echoing across the skyline. Eyewitnesses said entire residential blocks were shaking as Israeli jets carried out wave after wave of bombardments. Within hours, videos emerged showing plumes of smoke rising into the sky, shattered windows across entire neighborhoods, and families desperately trying to flee their homes. The IDF announced that its targets included what it called Hamas nerve centers, locations used for command and control, as well as underground tunnels stretching beneath Gaza. These tunnels, often referred to as the Metro, have been a long-standing strategic network for Hamas fighters, allowing them to move weapons and personnel without detection. Israel has repeatedly tried to destroy these passageways, but Hamas continues to rebuild them after every operation. This latest assault appears to be an intensified attempt to cripple that infrastructure once and for all. However, civilian casualties are rising fast. Palestinian health officials reported dozens of deaths within the first 24 hours, including women and children. International aid organizations are raising alarms, calling for immediate access to deliver medical supplies and food to the besieged population. Meanwhile, Hamas has vowed to retaliate, warning that rockets will once again rain down on Israeli cities if the strikes continue. Already, air raid sirens have been activated in southern Israel, with civilians rushing into shelters. The situation is volatile, and both sides appear prepared for a long and bloody confrontation. Israel's leadership has been very clear about the objectives of this campaign. Prime Minister and military officials have stated that the strikes are intended to dismantle Hamas' operational capabilities, cut off their supply of weapons, and eliminate top commanders. The IDF has emphasized that precision-guided munitions are being used to minimize civilian harm, but Gaza's dense urban population makes collateral damage almost unavoidable. This raises the issue of proportionality, which has become a focal point of international debate. Human rights organizations argue that regardless of military targets, the sheer number of civilian deaths and destruction of residential areas is unjustifiable. On the other hand, Israeli officials stress that Hamas deliberately embeds its fighters and weapons inside civilian neighborhoods, effectively using residents as human shields. This narrative has been at the heart of every major escalation between Israel and Hamas. The IDF claims this current campaign is different, saying it is more systematic and larger in scale than previous offensives. Analysts suggest that Israel is seeking not just to punish Hamas, but to fundamentally alter the balance of power in Gaza. Some reports indicate that Israeli ground forces may soon follow the air campaign, potentially turning this into a full-scale war. For Gaza civilians, the choice is grim: endure relentless airstrikes or face the chaos of ground battles. As the bombardments continue, the world is watching closely, questioning whether Israel can achieve its goals without plunging the region into deeper instability. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is worsening by the hour. The airstrikes have left entire neighborhoods without electricity, while water systems and communication lines have been severely damaged. Hospitals, already operating at limited capacity, are overcrowded with wounded civilians. Doctors describe the situation as catastrophic, with shortages of medical supplies, blood units, and even basic necessities like bandages. Aid agencies warn that Gaza is on the brink of a humanitarian disaster if the fighting does not stop soon. Families displaced by the strikes are crowding into schools, mosques, and makeshift shelters, many without access to clean drinking water or food. Children are among the most vulnerable, with psychological trauma adding to the physical dangers they face. Human rights groups are urging the international community to intervene, calling for immediate ceasefire negotiations to prevent further civilian suffering. Meanwhile, Israel insists it is providing warnings before some strikes, using phone calls and leaflets to tell civilians to evacuate. But critics argue that with Gaza's blockade and densely packed neighborhoods, evacuation is often impossible. Even when civilians attempt to flee, there are few safe places to go. The images emerging from Gaza, collapsed buildings, injured children, families digging through rubble, are fueling outrage worldwide. Social media is amplifying calls for action, with hashtags demanding accountability spreading across platforms. As aid organizations scramble to respond, pressure is mounting on world leaders to step in and find a way to halt the bloodshed before the situation spirals completely out of control. Section 5's 250 words. Hamas has not remained silent in the face of Israel's offensive. Within hours of the airstrikes, Hamas launched a series of rocket attacks targeting cities in southern and central Israel. Air raid sirens echoed across towns like Ashkelon and Ashdod, forcing residents into bomb shelters. Israel's Iron Dome defense system intercepted many of these rockets, but some managed to hit residential areas, causing damage and injuring civilians. Hamas officials declared that these strikes were just the beginning, promising a larger and more sustained response if Israel continued its campaign. Their rhetoric has been defiant, framing the conflict as a battle for survival and resistance against occupation. Analysts believe Hamas is attempting to project strength in the face of overwhelming Israeli firepower, rallying its supporters across Gaza and beyond. However, the reality is that Hamas' military capabilities are limited compared to Israel's. While their rockets can cause damage and instill fear, Israel's advanced defense systems and military technology give it a clear advantage. Still, the psychological impact of constant rocket alerts cannot be underestimated, with Israeli civilians living under the threat of attacks day and night. Hamas actions also risk escalating the conflict further, potentially drawing in other militant groups in the region. Already, there are reports of smaller factions preparing to join the fight. This tit-for-tat exchange of fire sets the stage for a prolonged and bloody confrontation, with neither side showing any willingness to back down. The regional response to the escalation has been swift. Arab states across the Middle East have condemned Israel's airstrikes, accusing it of committing atrocities against Palestinian civilians. Countries such as Egypt, Qatar, and Jordan have called for immediate international intervention, with Egypt reportedly attempting to mediate a ceasefire. Iran, a longtime supporter of Hamas, has strongly denounced Israel's actions and hinted at increasing its support to resistance groups in Gaza. Meanwhile, Israel's allies, including the United States and several European nations, have largely backed its right to self-defense, but urged restraint to avoid civilian casualties. This divide highlights the complex geopolitical landscape surrounding the conflict. For decades, the Israeli-Palestinian issue has been at the center of regional tensions, and every escalation threatens to destabilize fragile alliances. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has already made threatening statements, suggesting that further escalation in Gaza could spill over into northern Israel. The risk of a multi-front conflict is a nightmare scenario for Israeli security planners, and it raises the stakes significantly. Diplomatically, the United Nations Security Council has scheduled emergency meetings to address the crisis, but sharp divisions among member states may prevent any unified resolution. While condemnation grows, Israel seems determined to press forward, confident that its military advantage can achieve results. However, as the conflict escalates, the pressure from regional powers is intensifying, and calls for a ceasefire may soon turn into demands that cannot be ignored. The longer this continues, the greater the risk of regional instability. Beyond the regional players, the international community is also weighing in heavily. The United Nations Secretary General has expressed deep concern about the escalating violence, warning that continued hostilities could lead to a humanitarian catastrophe. Western capitals, including Washington, London, and Paris, are in a delicate position. On one hand, they reaffirm Israel's right to defend itself against rocket attacks. On the other, they cannot ignore the growing civilian death toll and the devastating scenes from Gaza. Protests have erupted in major cities worldwide, from London to New York, demanding that world leaders take a stronger stand against the bloodshed. Social media has amplified these calls, with viral videos from Gaza sparking outrage and galvanizing international solidarity movements. Human rights organizations are documenting alleged violations of international law, potentially paving the way for future investigations. Meanwhile, aid agencies are pleading for safe corridors to deliver medical supplies, food, and fuel into Gaza. Diplomats are scrambling to mediate, with Egypt and Qatar often playing key roles as intermediaries between Israel and Hamas. However, history shows that achieving a ceasefire is far easier than securing long-term peace. For now, global leaders are focused on preventing the situation from spiraling further, but their influence may be limited as both Israel and Hamas seem locked into a cycle of escalation. The world is watching closely, aware that each passing day of violence pushes the region closer to a tipping point, with consequences far beyond Gaza's borders. The military strategies at play reveal much about the objectives of both sides. Israel is leveraging its superior air power, surveillance, and precision-guided weapons to systematically dismantle Hamas infrastructure. The strikes are targeting command centers, rocket launch sites, and tunnels, with the goal of weakening Hamas' ability to sustain prolonged resistance. On the ground, however, Hamas is employing asymmetrical tactics. Its fighters are dispersed among civilian areas, using guerrilla-style methods to avoid direct confrontation with Israel's overwhelming firepower. Rockets, mortars, and small arms attacks are being used to maintain pressure and show defiance. Hamas also relies heavily on psychological warfare, broadcasting defiant messages and presenting itself as the defender of Palestinian rights, regardless of the damage inflicted on Gaza. Israel, meanwhile, faces the difficult task of balancing military objectives with international scrutiny. Each strike risks triggering condemnation and fueling global protests. Analysts suggest that Israel's leadership may be calculating that a swift and overwhelming offensive will shorten the conflict, achieving decisive results before international pressure forces a halt. Yet, the possibility of a drawn-out confrontation cannot be dismissed, especially if Hamas manages to sustain rocket fire for weeks. This tug-of-war between overwhelming force and resilient resistance defines the battlefield. For the civilians trapped in Gaza, however, strategy is irrelevant. The consequences are the same: fear, destruction, and loss. The military chess game being played out has devastating human costs, with no end in sight as both sides appear determined to press forward. The psychological toll of this conflict is staggering. In Gaza, generations have grown up under siege, where bombings are a recurring nightmare. Parents describe the terror of trying to calm their children as buildings shake and explosions roar in the distance. The trauma is long-lasting, with mental health experts warning that the scars of war will persist far beyond the physical destruction. Schools and playgrounds are now shelters, robbing children of any sense of normalcy. On the Israeli side, constant rocket sirens create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Civilians have only seconds to rush into shelters, and the anxiety of living under that pressure has a profound impact on daily life. Businesses shut down, schools close, and families live in constant anticipation of the next attack. The conflict is not only fought with weapons, but also with fear, and both populations are paying a heavy price. Meanwhile, political leaders on both sides frame the suffering as necessary for their cause. Hamas portrays civilian casualties as sacrifices for resistance, while Israel argues that civilian losses are the tragic result of Hamas tactics. In reality, ordinary people, families, children, the elderly bear the heaviest burdens. For many observers, this highlights the cyclical tragedy of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict: two populations locked in fear, mistrust, and trauma with no lasting peace in sight. The psychological wounds are deep, and even when the fighting stops, the recovery for both societies will be a long and difficult journey. As the conflict intensifies, questions about the future loom large. Will this operation fundamentally weaken Hamas, or will it only fuel further resistance and retaliation? Israel's strategy may achieve short-term military success, but history shows that Hamas has repeatedly rebounded after past offensives. On the other side, Hamas seeks to claim victory simply by surviving and continuing to fire rockets, framing itself as the defender of Palestinian resistance. The cycle of violence seems unbreakable, with each escalation sowing the seeds for the next. Regional powers may attempt to broker another ceasefire, but without addressing the root causes, the blockade, the occupation, the political stalemate, lasting peace remains elusive. For civilians in Gaza and Israel, the urgent hope is simply for the violence to stop, for the bombs to fall silent, and for some sense of safety to return. Yet, even if a ceasefire is declared, the wounds, physical, emotional, and political, will linger. The international community faces a critical challenge: how to move beyond temporary ceasefires toward meaningful dialogue and resolution. Without it, this conflict will continue to flare up, leaving behind more destruction, more trauma, and more lives lost. What we are witnessing today in Gaza City is not just another chapter in a long conflict. It may be a pivotal moment that shapes the trajectory of the region for years to come. The world is watching, but whether it will act decisively is the question that remains unanswered.